late autumn wind howled through the jagged peaks of the Colorado Rockies, carrying with it the promise of an early winter. Dust devils danced across the barren valley below, where the last stubborn patches of sagebrush clung to life in the unforgiving soil. This was country that broke men's spirits as easily as it broke their bodies. A land where the weak perished, and even the strong merely survived. Ezra Hawthorne had made his peace with his harsh mistress years ago. His cabin, built from pine logs he'd felled himself, sat nestled in a grove of aspens 3 miles up the mountain from the nearest excuse for civilization. A ramshackle collection of buildings that dared call itself Copper Creek. The isolation suited him fine. In the 5 years since he'd buried his wife and daughter beneath the old cottonwood by the stream, he'd found that solitude was the only companion that didn't remind him of what he'd lost. On this particular morning, Ezra descended the mountain trail on his mule, Winchester rifle across his lap, saddlebags empty save for a small pouch of silver coins. His monthly trip to town was a necessity he endured rather than enjoyed. Salt, coffee, ammunition, and perhaps a bottle of whiskey if his funds allowed. These were the extent of his needs. He had no use for the gossip and sideways glances that came free with every purchase. The sun climbed higher as he picked his way down the treacherous path, his breath visible in the crisp air. Below, Copper Creek sprawled like a festering wound against the landscape. Smoke rose from crooked chimneys, and even from this distance he could hear the faint notes of a poorly played piano drifting from the saloon. Ezra tied his mule outside Morrison's general store and conducted his business with characteristic brevity. Old Morrison, long accustomed to the mountain man's quiet ways, filled his order without attempting conversation. With his supplies secured, Ezra should have headed straight back to his sanctuary, but the whiskey called to him, not from thirst, but from habit. One drink to steel himself for the journey home. One drink to quiet the ghosts that seemed louder in town than they ever were in his cabin. The Broken Wheel Saloon was exactly what one would expect from a frontier watering hole. Sawdust covered the floor, absorbing spilled beer and blood with equal indifference. The air hung thick with tobacco smoke and the sour smell of unwashed bodies. Ezra pushed through the batwing doors and made his way to the far end of the bar, keeping his back to the wall, an old habit that had saved his life more than once. He was nursing his second whiskey when the commotion started. $20! The voice was slurred, desperate. $20 and she's yours! Ezra's jaw tightened. He'd heard that particular brand of desperation before. Some fool had drunk away his stake and was now trying to sell whatever he had left. Usually it was a saddle, sometimes a gun. He kept his eyes on his glass, determined not to get involved. "Come on now," the man continued, voice wobbling. "Someone must need help around their place. She's a good girl, strong for her age." Quote, the words sliced through the haze of whiskey like a blade of ice. Ezra turned slowly toward the source of the voice. A man stood near the poker tables, swaying on his feet. His clothes marked him as a farmer. Patched overalls, worn boots, the permanent stoop of someone who'd spent too many years behind a plow. But it was what stood beside him that made Ezra's blood run cold. A girl, no more than 8 or 9 years old, stood with her thin shoulders hunched and her eyes fixed on the floor. Her dress, once blue, had faded to the color of winter sky. Her dark hair hung in tangled strands around a face that was all sharp angles and hollow cheeks. She clutched a small cloth bundle to her chest, as if it contained all the worldly possessions she had, which it probably did. "She can cook, clean, tend animals," the farmer rambled, his words running together. "Just need enough for a horse." "Can't work my claim without a horse." The saloon had gone silent. Even the piano player had stopped his assault on the keys. Men looked away, uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. This wasn't the first time poverty had driven someone to such extremes, and it wouldn't be the last. "That's your daughter, Silas," someone said quietly. "You can't just—" "Can't what?" The farmer, Silas, whirled unsteadily. "Can't feed her? Can't keep a roof over her head? You offering to help, Tom? No? Then shut your mouth." Ezra's grip on his glass tightened until his knuckles went white. The scene before him blurred with memories he'd tried so hard to bury. Another man, another time, making the same devil's bargain. His own father selling his sister to pay gambling debts. The way she'd looked at him as the stranger led her away, pleading, terrified, betrayed. He'd been too young then. Too weak, too scared. Not now. I'll take her. The words left his mouth before he could stop them. Every head in the saloon turned to stare at the mountain man, who rarely spoke more than 3 words at a time. Silas blinked, trying to focus. You what? Ezra stood, his considerable height unfolding from the bar stool. I said, I'll take her. $20. He reached into his coat and pulled out the silver coins, counting them onto the bar with deliberate precision. $20. Nearly all he had. Enough for a horse. Enough for a man to convince himself he hadn't just sold his own flesh and blood. Well now, Silas said, a grotesque smile spreading across his face. Seems we got ourselves a deal, Mr. Hawthorne. Ezra moved toward them, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. Up. He could see the girl trembling, though whether from cold or fear he couldn't tell. Probably both. You hear that, Emma? Silas grabbed the girl's shoulder, shaking her slightly. This man's gonna take care of you now. You be good for him, you hear? The girl, Emma, finally looked up. Her eyes were the color of mountain lakes, clear and deep and filled with a pain no child should know. She looked at her father, then at Ezra, then back again. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Here, Silas pushed her forward. She's yours. Quote, the transaction complete, Silas snatched the money from the bar and stumbled for the door, eager to leave before conscience or witnesses could interfere. He didn't look back. Not once. Ezra stood there, uncertain what to do next. He'd acted on instinct, on rage, on ghosts he thought long dead. Now he had a child looking up at him with those haunted eyes, and he had no idea what came next. Come on, he said gruffly, voice rough from disuse. Let's get out of here. He turned and walked toward the door, not waiting to see if she followed. After a moment, he heard the soft shuffle of her worn shoes on the sawdust floor. Outside, the afternoon sun seemed too bright, too normal for what had just transpired. Ezra loaded his supplies onto the mule, acutely aware of the small figure standing a few feet away. What was he thinking? He could barely care for himself. His cabin was no place for a child. He should take her to the church, let them find a proper family. But when he looked at her, at the way she stood, shoulders drawn tight as a coiled spring, he knew he couldn't. Someone had failed this child. Many someones. He wouldn't add his name to that list. You ever ridden a mule? He asked. She shook her head. Well, come on then. Long walk ahead if we're gonna make it before dark. He lifted her onto the mule's back, surprised by how little she weighed. She sat stiffly, clearly terrified of falling but too proud or too scared to ask for help. Hold on to the saddle horn, he said, adjusting his supplies to give her more room. Bessie, here's steady. She won't let you fall. They left Copper Creek as the shadows began to lengthen, man, child, and mule making their slow way up the mountain trail. Ezra walked ahead, leading Bessie by her rope, his rifle slung across his back. Emma rode in silence, her small hands white-knuckled around the saddle horn. The first mile passed without a word. The second, too. It wasn't until they stopped to rest at a small spring that Ezra realized he had no idea how to talk to a child. His own daughter had been barely 3 when the fever took her. This one was older, shaped by hardships he could only guess at. There's water, he said, gesturing to the spring, if you're thirsty. She slid down carefully, cupped water in her hands and drank. Then she splashed some on her face before returning to stand beside the mule, still clutching her bundle. What's in there? Ezra asked. For a moment she didn't answer. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, my mama's handkerchief and a piece of cornbread. When'd you last eat? She shrugged. Ezra reached into a saddlebag and pulled out a piece of jerky. Here! She took it hesitantly, as if expecting him to snatch it back. When he didn't, she bit into it, chewing slowly to make it last. They continued on, as the sun began to sink behind the peaks, the cold air thick with silence and something unspoken, something fragile and new, forming between them in the fading light. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun had dropped behind the mountains. The last of the light bled through the trees, turning the aspens gold before fading into blue shadow. The air was sharp now, filled with the smell of pine and the coming cold. This is it, Ezra said, helping Emma down from the mule. Home! She stood there, his coat still hanging loose around her shoulders, the bundle clutched in her arms. The cabin looked small against the wilderness, a single flicker of man's defiance in a sea of untamed land. She didn't move, only stared at it like it might vanish if she blinked. "Go on," Ezra said gently. "Ain't much, but it's safe." Inside, the cabin was as plain as the man himself. One room, stone fireplace, narrow bed, small table, and a few tools hung neatly on the wall. He set his supplies down, struck a match, and lit the lamp. A warm glow filled the space, chasing away the chill. Emma stood by the door, too still, too quiet. She looked like a small animal caught between fight and flight. "You can sit," he said, motioning toward one of the chairs. "I'll fix us something to eat." She obeyed, sitting on the edge of the chair as though ready to run. The fire crackled, filling the silence between them. Ezra busied himself with the simple act of cooking. Beans, salt pork, and coffee. The same meal he'd eaten 1,000 times before. But tonight, it felt different. Tonight, he wasn't cooking for himself. He divided the food into 2 tin plates, giving her the larger portion. She looked down at it like she didn't know what to do. "Go on," he said. "Ain't fancy, but it'll fill your belly." She took a small bite, then another. After a few minutes, she was eating in earnest, hunger winning over fear. Ezra pretended not to watch, but he saw the way she guarded her plate, ready to pull it back if he reached too close. When she finished, he offered her more from his own portion. This time, she hesitated only a moment before accepting. They ate in silence, the fire their only witness. Outside, the wind picked up, whispering through the pines. When she finally set her fork down, she looked around the room, her small voice breaking the quiet. "Where do I sleep?" "You'll take the bed," Ezra said. "I'll make a spot by the fire." She froze, eyes darting to the bed, then to him. Her hands tightened on her bundle. Ezra saw the fear rise again. That bone-deep kind of fear that comes from knowing too much of the world, too young. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said softly, lowering his voice. "You're safe here, Emma, you understand? Safe." She didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at him, trembling. Ezra took a slow step back, then another, giving her space. "Look," he said after a moment, his tone gentle but firm. "You can keep your bundle close. You take the bed. I'll stay right here by the fire. Door stays barred. Nobody gets in. You have my word." He sat down on the floor, the firelight flickering across his weathered face. For a while, neither spoke. Then, in a voice so small he almost missed it, she whispered, "Papa said men don't keep their word." Ezra stared into the flames, his jaw tight. "Then your papa was wrong." She watched him for a long time, searching his face for something. Maybe truth, maybe mercy. "Why'd you buy me?" she asked suddenly. "You didn't have to." He swallowed hard, caught off guard by the question. "Guess I couldn't watch what was happening and do nothing. I seen something like that before. A man selling someone who didn't deserve it, couldn't stand by again." "Are you going to sell me like Papa?" she whispered. The question hit him like a hammer to the chest. His throat closed. For a long moment he couldn't speak. Then, without warning, tears welled in his eyes. Hot, unbidden, breaking through years of iron control. "No," he managed, his voice raw. "Never. You hear me? Never." He turned away, ashamed of his tears, wiping his face with rough hands. It had been 5 years since he'd cried, not even when he buried his wife and daughter. But now, here in this small cabin, a frightened child's question had undone him completely. Emma watched, wide-eyed, unsure what to do. Finally, she spoke again, hesitant. "Papa used to cry too when Mama died. Then he got mean." Ezra took a shaky breath. "I ain't your papa, Emma. I ain't gonna be mean to you. Not ever." She nodded slowly, clutching her bundle tighter. "You can have the bed," she said after a moment. "I don't need it. I can sleep on the floor." He shook his head. "No, child. That bed's yours now. I've slept on harder ground than this." "I used to sleep in the barn," she said quietly, when Papa remembered to unlock it. Ezra's fists clenched. "You won't ever sleep in a barn again. You've got a roof, a bed, and a fire now. That's a promise." She looked toward the bed, uncertain, then crept over and touched the blanket like it was something precious. Slowly she climbed onto it, still wearing his oversized coat. "I'll be right here," Ezra said, settling by the fire. "You can sleep. Nobody'll bother you." For a long time she lay awake, eyes open, staring at the rafters. Ezra sat with his rifle beside him, the firelight dancing over his face. Outside, wolves howled in the distance, their mournful cries echoing through the valley. "Just wolves," he said quietly. "They don't come near the cabin. Too scared to fire." "Papa said wolves would eat me if I ran away," she murmured. "Your papa said a lot of things that weren't true." Quote. Silence fell again, heavy but softer now, like the quiet after a storm. Then Emma spoke one last time. "My mama used to sing when she cooked. She knew a song called In the Sweet By and By. Do you know it?" Quote. Ezra stared into the flames. It had been Mary's favorite hymn, too. His wife's voice had filled their cabin with it once, back when laughter lived here. "I know it," he said finally. "Can you sing it?" Quote. "I don't sing much. Voice like mine, scare the wolves away for good." A small sound escaped her, not quite a laugh, but close. "Maybe just say the words," she whispered. Ezra took a deep breath, then spoke softly, the words trembling out like a prayer. "Now there's a land that is fairer than day, and by faith we can see it afar, for the Father waits over the way, to prepare us a dwelling place there." By the second verse, Emma's breathing had deepened. By the third, she was asleep. Ezra sat, watching the fire burn low, his eyes on the child curled up in the bed. Somewhere along this lonely road he'd taken on a new burden, or maybe a new purpose. He'd failed his family once. He wouldn't fail this one. Not again. Outside, snow began to fall, soft and silent, covering the rough mountain world in white. Inside, for the first time in 5 years, warmth and peace returned to Ezra Hawthorne's heart. The first snows of winter had given way to spring thaw, and with it came a transformation in the small cabin on the mountain. What had begun as an awkward arrangement between a grief-stricken man and a frightened child had slowly evolved into something resembling a family. Emma proved a quick learner. Within weeks, she was helping with the daily chores mountain life demanded. She learned to carry water from the stream without spilling, her thin arms growing stronger each day. She figured out how to bank the fire through the night and how to gather pine cones for kindling. "Hold the axe lower," Ezra instructed one morning as she tried splitting kindling. "Let the weight of the head do the work." She adjusted her grip, brought the hatchet down, and the wood split neatly. For the first time, she smiled. Small, but real. "That's it," he said. "You'll be running this place before long." That evening he treated the blisters on her hands with bear grease. She studied his rough palms. "My hands will look like yours someday." In time, everything worth learning takes time up here. As the seasons turned, so did their days. Ezra taught her to read the clouds and the wind, the behavior of birds before a storm, and the difference between a harmless track and a dangerous one. "This one's a cougar," he said, crouching by a print in the mud. "Female by the size, probably has kittens nearby." "How can you tell?" Mothers step careful, males stomp heavy. She absorbed every word. Out here, knowledge was survival, and survival, she'd already learned, was something worth fighting for. More than once, Ezra caught her watching him, not with fear now, but with the quiet curiosity of someone trying to understand what makes another person's heart tick. And he watched her too, watched the shadows fade from her eyes as the mountains began to heal her. By midsummer, Emma laughed sometimes. Not loud, not careless, but soft and real. She sang while cleaning fish or sweeping the porch, usually that same hymn he'd spoken to her the first night. The words had taken root. Then came the bear. Ezra had gone to check the trap lines, leaving Emma to tend the cabin. He was halfway back when he heard the rifle crack echo down the ridge. He ran, fear clawing at his chest. When he reached the clearing, Emma stood on the porch, her small rifle smoking in her hands. A black bear was lumbering away, startled and confused. "It was trying to get into the root cellar," she said, her voice steady, though her hands trembled. "You said, shoot high first to scare it, so I did." Ezra knelt, his chest still heaving. "You did right, Emma. You kept your head." That night she sat closer to him by the fire than usual. "I was scared," she admitted. "Be foolish not to be, but you didn't let fear take charge. That's what matters." From that day on, Ezra stopped seeing her as just a child. She was becoming something else, someone tough, capable, and proud, someone he'd fight to protect with his last breath. When autumn returned, Copper Creek began to whisper again. Folks down in town had long tongues and short memories. The mountain man who'd bought a girl for $20 was the kind of tale they liked to tell. One morning, the sound of hooves broke the quiet. Ezra stepped onto the porch and saw 3 riders approaching. Sheriff Garrett, Claude Morrison from the general store, and Isaac Hartley, the self-appointed voice of morality. "Morning, Sheriff," Ezra greeted, his tone wary. "You're up early." Garrett shifted in his saddle. "Need to talk, Ezra." "There's been complaints about the girl." Ezra's jaw tightened. "She's fine, healthy, fed, schooled." Hartley scowled. "A man living alone with a child that's not his. Folk are bound to talk." Emma appeared at the door, barefoot, her chin raised. "I want to stay here," she said firmly. "Mr. Hawthorne takes good care of me." "She's been coached," Hartley said. "She's been raised," Ezra corrected coldly. "Something you might not understand." Garrett dismounted. "Let's do this right. Mind if we look around?" "Go ahead." Inside, they found the cabin neat and orderly. Emma's bed was clean, her clothes folded. The shelves were stocked with food. She even showed them her school slate filled with careful letters and numbers. "She reads better than most town children," Morrison admitted quietly. Hartley wasn't done. "And you let her handle weapons?" Ezra crossed his arms. "We live in bear country, not Boston. She needs to know how to protect herself." The sheriff examined Emma's rifle target out back, holes clustered tight in the center. He whistled. "That's fine shooting." When they were done, Emma surprised them all by speaking. "I was scared when Papa sold me," she said, "but I ain't scared here. Mr. Hawthorne never hurt me. He cried when I asked if he'd sell me too." The men fell silent. Even Hartley couldn't find his voice. Finally, Sheriff Garrett cleared his throat. "Far as I'm concerned, the child's well cared for. Let's head back." As the riders left, Emma looked up at Ezra. "They won't take me, will they?" Quote, "Not while I'm breathing," he said. Winter came early that year, fierce and hungry, snow piled high against the cabin walls. The wolves returned, their howls circling the clearing. Ezra and Emma fought through it together, splitting wood, rationing food, tending traps. When Ezra grew weak from hunger, Emma nursed him with pine needle tea and willpower alone. "Learned from the best," she whispered when he woke. When spring finally came, they stood side by side watching the thaw. The world glittered fresh and new, as if it had been remade for them. "We did it," Emma said. "Aye," Ezra replied, "we did." But peace on the frontier was never permanent. Word came that Silas Kane, Emma's birth father, had died in the lowlands. He'd carried a letter addressed to her. Emma opened it by the fire that night. Her hands shook as she read. "Emma, I know what I done was wrong. You got every right to hate me. Tell Hawthorne, thank you for being the father I couldn't be. I'm sorry." She cried then, not for the man he was, but for the father he never became. Ezra held her close, saying nothing. Some wounds couldn't be mended with words. In time, the cabin filled with laughter again. Emma grew taller, surer, her blue eyes bright with life. She hunted, cooked, studied, dreamed. Sometimes she talked of teaching other children, of helping the lost find their way, just as he'd helped her. One evening they stood on the porch, watching the sun slip behind the peaks, painting the sky in gold and rose. "Papa," she asked quietly. "Thank you for seeing me that day in the saloon." He smiled, rough and tender all at once. "Best $20 I ever spent." She laughed, then took his hand. Together they watched the last light fade from the mountains, content in the quiet truth they'd built. A man once broken and a child once sold had found something worth living for. Family. And in the vast silence of the Rockies, that was enough.